Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about training load. So we're gonna dive in a little bit deeper. See what I did there? Gonna dive in a little bit deeper into exactly how intense different workouts should be. Today we're not going to talk too much about periodization because we have that coming up. But essentially, I want to point out to this photograph of the different dive platforms and look to see how the top platform is overcrowded. And in my eyes, that maybe represents sort of like maximal training. And so many people think that when they go to the train, they think that they're supposed to maybe go as hard as possible or to do everything that they can. But with periodization, we'll get into that a little bit more about how there's at different times you're going to go through different load intensities, and those different loads are going to cause a different stimulus, and you get a different adaptation. So we don't always want to go to the top platform and go maximal. And on the other hand, we also don't want to, be jumping off of the dock. You want to go up and have some intensity and be training with intensity. But we will dive into that more. So this is a scale for optimum growth rate for microbacteria, so bacterial cells. But I think the same scale really applies to what we do in the weight room. Now, when we train minimally, when there's a minimum stress, the growth rate is low, almost non-existent. And when the growth rate when the intensity is maximum, there's not too much growth there as well. There's a time and a place for everything. We want our training to exist around that optimum range. Optimum is optimal. So let's spend some time on this chart. Going to kind of go into some pointers that I have given in the past and just try to help you all be more successful than some of your predecessors. So when using this chart, once again, if we're pursuing strength and it says 85 and above, that really represents sort of that space. That's really going to represent sort of all these cells up here. So that's where our strength is best maintained or improved. And again, that doesn't mean that you can't go out and use reps of 10 or 20 and get stronger. In fact, they've proven that you can. But if you want to train in the zone that is most directly correlated to your 1 rep max and your maximal strength, 85% and above is kind of where you want to spend your time. So be thinking about that when you are referring to your percentiles for your training. Oftentimes, people will look over at the left here and they'll think, okay, 85% and above is, sort of this chart here, and any training that goes on up here, I'm now working on strength. Yes, as long as you're getting better and stronger at some of these other reps, you probably have a great chance at improving your strength. But again, remember, sort of that upper left corner is where the magic happens regarding strength. Other mistakes might be sort of a misuse and abuse of the chart. So whether it's on different weeks or different sets throughout the day, perhaps the intention is to stair step up and become more intense over time. Perhaps that's the intention. But what individuals may actually do is they sort of misread the chart or misuse it, or maybe they're not using it at all. So let's say it's on a given day, an individual might have a warm-up set of 10 reps at 60%, and then they may go to 8 reps at 70% and 6 reps at 76%. And then how about 4 reps at 85%? So as you can see, this individual has elevated their intensity with every set. While their volume is going down, because their intensity is spiking appropriately, they are training in a linear fashion. They're having what would be sort of an appropriate warm-up or an appropriate batch of sets for a given day if they want to finish on a high note. Oftentimes you will see individuals attempt to do the same thing, and they may start out with 10 reps at 60%, and then at 8 reps they do, let's say, 74, 75%, and then at 6 reps, for whatever reason, they use the same percent. They use sort of that 74% again. And so now they start pinging downward. And then for the 4th set, maybe they jump back up to 83%. So in this case, which although this seems illogical and unlikely, I promise you I've seen similar or worse patterning with programming. And if that's your rationale, if you want to argue or say that there is some sort of wave loading protocol, if that's what you're saying, if that's what you're telling me, and if that's what you believe, and you have maybe a little bit of research or experience to back it up, then go for it. If that matches your philosophy, go for it. But honestly, would you rather train with just a linear line there? Or would you sort of bounce around and maybe not have such a good rationale for that? For me personally, I sort of stick to, or I appreciate, the more logical and rational approach. Now, that does not mean that you couldn't do all kinds of other things, such as a few warm-up sets that sort of take you up here, and then maybe a drop set finisher that exists down here or something like that. So maybe set 1 is here, set 2 is there, set 3 is here, and then set 4 is down here. That doesn't mean that any of these is right or wrong. My biggest goal with you all using charts like this would be to encourage you to have rationale and logic behind what you're doing. And that way, and maybe as you're listening to what I'm saying, you're rolling your eyes and thinking that this is a waste of time. But that's okay too, because it's all about you developing your rationale, your logic, your philosophy. If you don't like the theories and the approach that I'm describing, then you can move on and find something that you do like and that does work for you. But I would encourage you to have some science and some logic and rationale behind what you're doing, besides maybe it just being a really hard workout of some sort. So that's really more what today is about, is just discussing how to apply training loads. So you could ramp up and then do a drop set. You could ramp up, you could stay at the same intensity but reduce volume. You guys can do whatever you want. And then again, we talked earlier, our first couple of slides with the high dive and that chart on cell growth. You don't want to train maximally. You don't want to be living in here, whether it's week after week or set after set. So, if you're going to do maybe some pyramid sets up, like 10, 8, 6, 4, something along those lines. If you did a 10 at 72, an 8 at 80, 6 at 85, and a 4 at 90, what you've essentially done is just maxed out 4 times in a row. And let's say you hit that first set of 10 at 72.5%. Remember, you're maxing out. At that 10 set, you're probably not going to be able to do an 11th rep. So you've really challenged the lifter, and you haven't left a lot of room for error. They need to be feeling good that day in order to hit that set. And then to challenge them to max out again and perform at 100% capacity again on the following set, that's extremely demanding, and starting to become a little unlikely to happen. So what might serve some of us a little bit better would be to just exist a little bit below that. And again, if you're talking about warm-up sets on a given day, start light and finish heavy. You know, as long as you're just warming up, if that's not your work sets, all that warm-up is going to do is reduce injury and improve performance. So these are some of the issues that I see on a common or regular basis when young exercise scientists or maybe some coaches who are new to these types of protocols or these types of templates. These are some of the things I see them struggle with on a regular basis. So remember, warm up, use it appropriately, have a logic, know why you're doing what you're doing. And honestly, you know, read some of these notes over here to get some better insight. These are some great notes that Donnell Boucher put in. And yeah, we'll move on, and we're going to practice this just a little bit more coming up. Okay, so returning back to that template that we showed off in our Excel day, and sort of using a pretty simple lower body day. And I've only put in some sets and reps for one training day, and only put that information in on our squat, just because we don't really need to. We don't need any drama. We don't need a whole lot of mess of information on here. We're just going to keep it simple. So again, if we went 10 reps at 60, this is maybe our first warm-up set, maybe our second warm-up set, and that's going to be moderate. Still, I mean, that's a decent warm-up set. That should get you fairly warm and get you going pretty good. And then 8 reps at 70% is in the moderate plus zone. And then as we go to 6 reps at 76.5%, okay, as you can see, I sort of borrowed off the chart a little bit. Now we're going heavy. This is really a work set, whereas those first 2 sets are more of just warm-up sets and maybe setting the groove of movement for the day, waking those muscles up a little bit. With that 4th set at 85.5%, for 4 reps, we're now in that heavy plus zone. So with set 1 and then 2 and 3 and 4, we've actually climbed the chart in pretty fine fashion to improve our intensity while decreasing our volume. You know, everything is pretty realistic. Even this top set is only at 95% of the 1 rep max. So, or even at 85.5%, we're only at 95% of our 90th percentile, or our 100% effort at 4 reps. So pretty reasonable, aggressive, but pretty reasonable. So there's, this isn't a perfect program, but there's some things that I like about it as far as utilizing the chart and just keeping things simple. And again, this is just a drop in the bucket, one in millions of ways that you could approach it. But just sort of keep that in mind, is that that's a simple and easy way to climb on a given day. We had a couple of warm-up sets, we had a couple of work sets, and we took the liberty of getting into higher work zones on every set. Okay, so we've discussed our relative intensity table based off of our 1 rep max. And that is one way of communicating and tracking intensity of training or training load. There are other ways. Now, back in 1982, some research was done with Borg scale. And as you can see, the scale goes from 6 to 20. And that might seem like some, mystical, wacko kind of stuff. But the reason that it goes from 6 to 20 is that it's really common to have a resting heart rate of 60 beats per minute. And for a lot of people, 200 beats per minute is their max heart rate. So when you're doing some type of cardiovascular efforts, the 6 through 20 Borg scale works pretty darn well, especially when you have experienced or advanced athletes or a trained population where they know their body a little bit better. They're going to better be able to pinpoint and sort of stay calm. You know, a newbie who's maybe starting out running, they may do some running and their heart rate might be at 150, and they might say that, you know, this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because they're not used to having a heart rate up and breathing hard and sweat pouring down their face. So you're going to get some skewed results with a newer population, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it's not as effective as with the advanced athletes who know their bodies a little bit better. So that Borg scale can be modified and used for, it can still be used for conditioning with the 0 to 10 or the 0 to 10 version. But this is also something good that you can start to translate into post-exercise tracking and surveys. So to have a whole team do a certain run at a certain time, and then afterwards ask them, how hard was that on a scale of 1 to 10? And then you might group athletes based on what kind of score they gave you. Or what you might do is borrow this idea and translate it into strength training. And with strength training, when you start tracking based on how hard it felt, and you start limiting sets based on how much more you feel like they might be able to do, you're practicing auto-regulation. So if we go, let's say we go back, let's talk about auto-regulation for a moment. Okay, so if we're auto-regulating, I know I'm going a little drawing crazy here, so hopefully this isn't bothering you guys too much. If we're auto-regulating, and if we tell our athletes to work up to a single rep at 95% of their 1 rep max, but instead of telling them, let's say they bench press 100 pounds, and let's say we tell them to work up to 95% or 95 pounds, if on one of their warm-up sets, they do 85% and they felt like that was really, and they felt like that was a 95% effort, then you would maybe just get rid of that last set and say, okay, you accomplished your goal for the day. We wanted you to do a single at 95% effort. And for whatever reason, maybe you slept poorly last night, or you did after practice yesterday, they had a push-up competition and you were like one of the finalists, you did a whole bunch of push-ups, maybe something happened, or maybe you're fighting with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or it's midterms week or whatever it is. Maybe there's some extra stress that causes that 85% to feel like 95%. And through auto-regulation, by listening to the body, what you do is you avoid maximum training, and instead you are reverting to optimum or optimal training. So auto-regulation is a little bit trickier. It brings in some of the artistic side. It brings in a little bit more of the artistic side, because you just have to start to ask more questions and see how they're feeling, and let how they're feeling sort of determine maybe some of their weights. Maybe that means, and this is a little bit, this is sort of riskier, because you may have a stubborn athlete who thinks that they can add 30 more pounds, even though they barely scraped by the last weight. but they just believe in themselves and they really want to get strong. And it's for all the right reasons, is that they want to add all that weight, but it gives you the wrong result, is that they get buried by it. And on the other side, on the other hand, you might have somebody who doesn't really care about strength training. They're not worried about improving in this lift, or maybe improving at all. And they just want to be lazy and kind of like skate by and hang out in the back of the crowd. And so they may say, "Oh, that was really hard. I don't think I can do another set, and I definitely can't go any heavier than that." So you start with that auto-regulation. You start to sort of see people abuse the system, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So, but that auto-regulation, it can also do great things, because when we're not at our best, but we're training as if we are, we end up accidentally training maximally. And if we're having a great day and the training protocol is of medium intensity, we sort of end up training minimally. So some auto-regulation in there offers us some interesting options. Okay, so to provide a little bit more context with the RPE and lifting, we've got options. So we already discussed how you might track it with just sort of a 0 to 10. And that, honestly, they've done quite a bit of research in using percentages for strength training and comparing it to RPE. And a lot of lifters are sort of like right on the button. So it's pretty trustworthy, although it kind of seems like it's off. And again, I would sort of reserve this for more experienced or advanced lifters. So you can sort of just talk about their general effort level. And I know this little figure is run on treadmill, but we can do it for cardio or for strength training and resistance training. We can use it for just the percentage of our 1 rep max, so we know our relative intensity table. And we can also use additional repetitions that are possible. And for me, when I went and worked at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, the head strength coach was Kaz Kazadi, and this is where I was introduced to reps in the tank. So reps in the tank are sort of the additional reps that are possible. So when we're just talking about RPE, we can take that same program that we had earlier, and let's say our lifters have not tested yet. They don't have 1 rep maxes going. Or let's say maybe something along the lines of being in season and wanting to make sure that all the athletes are feeling good and that we're prioritizing how they feel on game day. That's another option for moving to RPE, and I'm sure several more reasons could be rationalized. But let's look at, we've got the same rep scheme that we did when we were using the relative intensity table, and we sort of borrowed that same intensity structure there, and all we did was we took out the percentiles. So remember, this was 60%. Oh man, terrible penmanship here. So that was 10 by 60%, and that was 10 by 70%, and that was 6 by 75%, and that was 4 by 85%. But now we've switched over to an RPE, and it seems kind of silly, telling an athlete, do 6 reps at about 7.5 out of 10 effort on this. A new lifter, that's just going to kind of shut them down. They're not even going to know where to start with that. But as you get a little bit more advanced and you feel you're getting warmed up and you're feeling how your body's going, it's not a terrible system. And if you've got the right athlete who's listening to their body and is in tune with their body, you would end up with almost an identical training day in a perfect world. So the technique used over here of just using the 0 to 10 RPE, it would actually hopefully put us in a very similar position. It would actually put us in almost an identical position as if we were using relative intensity off of, or if we were using a percentile off of our 1 rep max. So that's another option. And again, I sort of preemptively was talking about reps in the tank there from Baylor. This is a great way to communicate. You have the same idea as if you want to auto-regulate, and if you want to give lifters a little bit of control, and you want to say, okay, how many do you think you can do here? And you kind of want to start having those conversations. This is sort of that sweet spot in between cut and dry relative intensity percentiles and that RPE. So how many reps in the tank, or telling them how many reps to leave in the tank, this is kind of in the middle there. And so what you end up doing is maybe saying something like this. You would say 10 reps and leave 5 reps in the tank there. Okay, so because if you see leaving 5 reps, where you could do 5 more reps, that's at about 60% 1RM. And when we originally programmed this off of our relative intensity, off of our 1 rep max, that's right where we were. We said 10 reps at 60%. So if we've instructed them to leave 5 reps left in the tank, then we've hopefully landed somewhere near 60%. And then the same thing for a set of 8 reps and instructing them to leave 4 reps in the tank. When we get to 4 reps, 4 reps that are not done. And again, this is like we would do the full set of 8 reps and we'd rack the bar or whatever it was. And we'd say, I could have done 12 total reps. So I could have done 4 more reps. So at 4 reps in the tank, you're looking at about 70% of your 1 rep max. And so what we end up doing is we end up having these same sort of identical results and approach. So this is one of the better ways to do it, just by changing the way you're communicating. You're going to get the same thing you want, or similar to the same thing you want, even if you haven't tested them. And I would say that the reps in the tank makes more sense to athletes who are even a little bit on the novice side. Maybe not your true novices, because they don't know their bodies, they don't know the lifts, they don't know how their body responds to certain weights. But with less experience, the reps in the tank, I believe, is more successful than the predictive RPE. It's just a different way of saying it, and it just seems to work better. So again, remember why you're training. Remember to stay in your proper loads. And then you have subsequent reps, sets, and rest periods. But remember to keep the goal the goal. The goal is to keep the goal the goal. And I would say one of the biggest problems with the use of load prescriptions is that people are going to, well, I guess the 2 biggest problems. One is that people just get sidetracked and they end up doing little to no work in their training goal intensity range. And the other problem is that people forget to give athletes warm-ups and to get them into some of these higher rep sets. And so you end up miscalculating how much time a lift can take. You end up maybe risking the athlete's health, because if you're just going to jump into a set of 85% and you haven't done 2 or 3 warm-up sets ahead of time, you're you're kind of asking for trouble. Okay, so as far as load goes, you don't have to test everything. And this is one of the big benefits for utilizing those big powerlifting movements, such as the squat, the bench, the deadlift, and possibly the overhead press. So one of the nice benefits of testing those out, or an Olympic lift such as the clean, is that those big lifts, again, there's a good argument as far as how useful those are. If I've got a cross country athlete, do I really need to upgrade their squat and their bench press? Yeah, maybe that might really help them be more injury resilient, and it might help them be more explosive, and might give them some strength that allows them to perform better overall. Is it as important for them as it is for maybe a football lineman? Probably not. I think we can all agree there. But these big movements, they become more important when you start looking at the fact that we can derive training percentages from these big movements because they're so popular and because others have sort of walked in these footsteps before us. We have been able to create some charts based on big lifts and be able to see how they sort of relate to other lifts. So if you look at a hang clean and you max it out, then these would be the percentages that correlate to the given movement. So you don't have to max out a below knee clean to know how much it is related to a hang clean. And that doesn't mean that 90% that a below knee clean is always going to be 100% of a hang clean, but it's going to be a great starting place, and it's probably going to be pretty close. And I'm pulling these numbers from some exercise menus that I've collected over the years from different organizations. And what I'll do is I will create a link to share it, and I'll put it in the notes below the video. So again, just to give a few more examples, we'll sort of work our way through this just a little bit more. Looking at here, again, that bench press, not anywhere near as important as it is popular, but it is popular, it is common. A lot of lifters like performing it, and it is useful. I like to badmouth it, but I also like to bench press. I also like to have quite a few of my athletes bench press. So there's some rationale. Okay, so when we bench press, we can derive that our dumbbell bench press is going to be 40% of our 1 rep max of our bench press. And that's for training loads. Okay, so just by maxing out our bench press, we can then later prescribe and predict how much weight to give different athletes if we're doing a very different exercise of a dumbbell bench press. And the logic and the rationale for this is that, and I stole this from Mike Boyle, is he said for many movements, when you're going from a barbell to a dumbbell, because of the instability of the dumbbell, it's usually going to be a little bit closer to 80% of the barbell movement. And for the bench press, this seems to hold pretty true. So when you take a bench press, let's say the lifter bench presses 100 pounds, and then you shift it over to dumbbells. Okay, so remember what Mike Boyle said? He said go to 80% of your bench press. So now with dumbbells, we're looking at 80% or 80 pounds. But because it's dumbbells, you divide that in 2, and now you have 40. It's essentially 40% of 100% of your bench press. AKA for our 100-pound bench presser, a 40-pound dumbbell would be their maximal dumbbell. And then just like we do with all of our relative intensity work and everything else we've been talking about today, we can then program off of that dumbbell predicted estimate. And we can find ways to train and ways to get pretty pretty accurate predictions on how much weight they should do for dumbbells, whether they're doing hypertrophy work, endurance work, power work, or strength work. I believe this is our last. Sort of scale or slide for this batch of sharing for this exercise menu of comparing certain movements to other movements. And I wanted to add in that if the back squat is at 100, I wanted to add in that a rear foot elevated squat is going to originally be at what I found is pretty accurate, 42.5. And then several workouts into that, it's going to be more like 48%. And then once a lifter becomes really proficient at it, that RFE squat a lot of times is going to become more like 60%. And I've seen that enough times to believe it to be true. Is that, and I'll talk a little about this a little bit more in our unilateral versus bilateral movement video. But that first time that lifters are performing that RFE squat, if they're used to doing a bunch of back squatting and they don't hardly ever do RFE squats, or they've never done them, yeah, you're going to be in the low 40s the first time around. But once the lifters are getting used to it, that weight can climb up pretty good. So keep that in mind, is that not only are these numbers estimates and predictions, but they can also change as lifters become more proficient at these movements. So another example of that would be front squat. So based off of your back squat, if you have athletes who are back squatting very regularly but rarely front squatting, and they go front squat, that front squat is going to start out around 65%. And the biggest reason there I found is that a lot of it has to do with the technique and just getting athletes to be comfortable in actually racking that bar. So they may have all this strength and comfort when the bar's on their back, but to bring them out here, if they're not used to that front squat, it's a problem. It causes trouble for them. So I think for a lot of lifters, you're going to be 60, 65% just starting out. Now, let's say they're comfortable. It's going to be right around 70%. If they're comfortable, holding that rack position. And then if you start doing as much front squatting, or you're front squatting as frequently, because a human being should probably not be front squatting pound for pound as much as they are back squatting. But if you're front squatting as frequently and as intensely as you are back squatting, that front squat might go up to 80%. So in looking at Olympic lifters who sort of live and die by having that bar in that front rack position and their ability to front squat it, they do a whole load of work on that front squat, probably more than any other just general population. So their front squats are going to be, really pushing that limit, trying to catch up to their back squats, because that bar never goes on their back. So they only need a front squat. So they're going to be really good at front squatting, and they're probably going to be at 80%, maybe a little bit higher than that, actually. So those are just a couple of notes and just things to think about, is that not only are these estimates and predictors, but they're also very easy to change once you are consistently training with a new movement or a variation of a movement. And I also wanted to add, I forgot to add this earlier. So I wanted to add, if is 100% or pounds or whatever. The floor press, which I think when we did our upper body push day, I believe I failed to do a floor press. So I'll add in a note I'll add in a video link to a floor press, just so that you guys know what it is, because it's a great movement. It's a great option. That floor press is typically going to be, now again, it depends how often you're floor pressing. If you're hardly ever floor pressing, just the uniqueness of it and sort of the demand for control, you may be down to 80, maybe 85%. And once you're doing it commonly and frequently, it's probably going to be about 90% of your floor press, or of your bench press, excuse me. And then if you're like me and your shoulder health is not so great, it might be a little bit more like the same weight as your bench press. Oftentimes I'm floor pressing more than I'm bench pressing. So it's not only predictors and estimates, but it can also change. And with different persons, they might actually just be built weird, and different exercises might actually appeal to them a little bit more. So taking a look at a few different variations of everything we've talked about today, we're going to look at how some movements may be different, along with the use of different intensity indicators. And I'm going to kind of buzz through this, but I just really want to put this in front of everybody's face. I know it's a little bit of a recap of what we talked about today. So if we're doing a squat percentage, and let's say we're squatting, and we've already reviewed this approach multiple times today. I just want to point out that on the front squat, if that front squat's at 80% of your 100% back squat, then this is how you would program your front squat based off of your back squat. Now, you wouldn't necessarily write in, the athletes don't need to, you don't necessarily want the athletes thinking that they're front squatting this sort of approach, because what they're doing is they're squatting 60% of their front squat max. But if you're predicting it, and when you're typing in your calculations, what you're really going to do is either you're going to take your back squat and translate it to 80% for your front squat, and then you'll pull your numbers from your front squat. Or if you're just pulling numbers from your back squat, this is what they would look like. They would look like 48% for 10, 56% for 8, 61.5% or 61.2 for 6, and 68% for 4. Again, these are the same intensity. This is just different poundage, and that is how you would get the numbers, just to better understand the carryover. And then looking at our forward lunge at 50%, keep in mind, there's only one leg firing, or one leg dominant in this movement. So all you're doing here is you're taking that number and you're just cutting it in half. So it sort of makes sense, right? It's pretty logical. One leg is half the intensity, or half the load, excuse me. Same intensity. It just looks very different. And so I would advise that everyone just do a little bit of extra work. And when you're front squatting, still call it by the percentages relative to the maximal of the front squat. Because 4 reps at 68% doesn't sound like much, but when you understand that those 4 reps are actually at 85.5%, it gives you a little bit better insight to how hard you're supposed to be working. So that's just a little bit of, I'll get off my soapbox on that, but I would always tend to display bigger percentages because it better conveys how hard this workload actually is. And that's probably just because I made that mistake in the past, or I regret posting things like reps and sets in the 30th percentile. Not sure I ever did that, but in the lower percentiles of a derivative movement, such as a front squat or a lunge. And then here's the same thing for the RPE. And keep in mind that for the RPE, because you're already, even though, here, let me clean this up a little bit. We're just about done here, guys. Stick with me. Don't give up on me just yet. So even though there's lower percentages for the front squat and for the forward lunge, your RPE are the same. So we've talked about having principles and methods before. So if your squat is your principle for the day, is that you want to work that squat pattern and you also want to work at that intensity. So you almost have like two principles there. But if somebody comes in and they say, my back is bothering me a little bit today, can I do something else? You might just zip them over into some forward lunges because they're going to handle half the load on their spine, but they're going to get the same work in. They're going to get some squat patterning, and they're going to work just as hard if you trust that athlete to live up to their RPE. So all you're doing is changing your method, but you're maintaining your same principles. So that's another benefit there, is that there's not a whole lot of thought that goes into it. You say, oh, your back hurts, you're doing forward lunges instead. And then for that's just the in the tank variation, again, you don't have to change anything because it automatically conveys the intensity to the lifter and how they're feeling that day. So there's benefits to that. If you're willing to risk the knuckleheads who are going to bite off way more than they can chew and get buried, and if you're also willing to risk sort of your lazy workers who just want to do less. So these are a few ways to display and convey workloads. I think that's all we have for today, guys. Good work. Thanks for sticking around. See ya.